Live from the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences in beautiful downtown Raleigh, it's the Science Cafe with your host, Chris Smith.
All right. Let's get started, everybody. Hi, welcome to the I guess I should use this lectern. Welcome to the Science Cafe, everybody. My name's Chris. I'm curator for the Daily Planet Theater, your host for our weekly Thursday night Science Cafe. With all these fabulous people here to learn about paleontology. Who likes dinosaurs? Fantastic job. Yeah, people who come to museums tend to like prehistoric life quite a bit. And here at the Museum of Natural Sciences, we have an incredible paleontology team that does, in fact, include Dr. Paul Brinkman. He's our guest speaker tonight, but besides being a paleontologist, geologist, Dr. Brinkman is also the head of our History of Science Research Lab. You can normally find him either in the Paleontology Research Lab sometimes, or you'll find him in his office, which is its own library sometimes. It sort of looks like it. Or you'll find him down in the museum library with all of the fabulous tomes of history and science that we have here in our museum. And tonight we're going to dive in to a little bit of paleontology history, which is interesting. We're going to take a look back at people who take a look way back, which is kind of a fun thing to do, I think. Some housekeeping things, though, that I want everybody to know before Paul comes up and gets us started with tonight's cafe is that next Thursday night at 7 o'clock, we'll have Dr. Rob Dunn from North Carolina State University. Yeah, there's Rob Dunn fans in the house. And he's going to be talking about his newest book, Never Home Alone. But instead of here in the Daily Planet Cafe, that event is going to be in the other building of the museum on the first floor in the WRAL 3D Theater. So mark your calendars for that one. The cafe will close at 5 o'clock as usual for any other day of the week, but we'll have food and drinks available for purchase in the other building. So make sure you come and join us over there next Thursday night. The week after that is Science Trivia. We'll be back in here. And then after that week, I know I'm getting way ahead of you, but I want everybody to know, we'll be back in the 3D Theater in 3 weeks. So we're going to be in here for Science Trivia. That's it for the next 3 weeks. Next 2 Science Cafes will be presentations, the book, and then a film screening in 3 weeks next door. Okay, everybody wrote that down, right? You got it in your calendar? Okay, fantastic. So, who's ready to make some research from rubbish? All right. Ladies and gentlemen, folks, Dr. Paul Brinkman.
Thanks, Chris. Can everybody hear me? All right, good. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks, Katie, for inviting me to do Science Cafe today. So I want to talk about, this is kind of an unusual title. I imagine you're probably wondering what on earth is he going to talk about. I want to talk about the sometimes really unusual sources for paleontological scholarship in the 19th century. So that's the title, Research from Rubbish. All right, let's see if this works. All right, it does. Okay, so a little bit of introduction. So how many of you have heard of the American Museum of Natural History in New York City? How many of you have been there? Okay, oh, that's pretty good. All right, so the American Museum of Natural History, for those of you who don't know, has the largest collection of dinosaurs in the world. It's considered maybe the premier place to do dinosaur paleontology, certainly in America, but arguably in the world. It has a huge collection, lots of excellent scholars, but there was a time not that long ago when they didn't have any dinosaurs at all. And in fact, in this slide, and I think one of these is a pointer. Is it this one? No, that doesn't work. All right, it doesn't. I'll point up here. Does this? What's the pointer on there? The big one. Press it. Oh, okay. All right, I had the wrong button. All right, so this is my pointer. Yeah, there we go. So that's Henry Fairfield Osborn right there in the back. That's Barnum Brown, and that right there, trying to hold this steady. See this? This is a bone. This is the very first dinosaur ever collected by the Department of Vertebrate Paleontology at the American Museum of Natural History. So they have thousands and thousands and thousands of dinosaurs in New York. That's dinosaur number 1. That's a tibia of a diplodocus, and that is Como Bluff, Wyoming, one of the most famous American Jurassic dinosaur localities of all time. All right, now the guy in the background, as I mentioned, is Henry Fairfield Osborn. He was the founder and first curator of the Department of Vertebrate Paleontology at the AMNH in New York. And the guy in front of him is, as I mentioned, Barnum Brown. How many of you have heard of Barnum Brown? All right, so I figured the three of you had. Barnum Brown is arguably the most famous and probably the most successful dinosaur hunter of all time. He's the discoverer of Tyrannosaurus rex, for instance. In fact, in a fairly recent biography, actually it's not that recent anymore, I guess it's about 10 years old by now, the subtitle of that biography was The Discoverer of Tyrannosaurus rex. So that's what he's most famous for. But in fact, he collected thousands and thousands of dinosaur specimens over the course of his career with the AMNH. But at this point, in 1897, he's a nobody. So the guy in the background is in charge. He's the founder and first curator of the DVP, the Department of Vertebrate Paleontology at the AMNH. And the guy in front of him, Barnum Brown, is a seasonal collector. He doesn't even have a permanent job. And if you look closely at this picture, there's a lot of lessons you can draw from this picture, but the one I want to focus on right now is that this is the very first dinosaur, as I mentioned, collected by the DVP at their very first dinosaur field locality at Como Bluff, Wyoming. Barnum Brown opened this quarry, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but Henry Fairfield Osborn, the guy in the background, he came out for a supervisory visit. All right? Now, if you look really closely, you can see that Barnum Brown, the guy in the foreground, right, the younger guy in the foreground, he's wearing work gloves. He's got a marsh pick in his hands. But if you look closely at Henry Fairfield Osborn in the background, you'll see he's wearing a dress coat. He's got dress gloves on. I blew that up because I knew it would be impossible to see, but you can see here. Look at that. He's wearing dress gloves. He's got a hat, and he's not holding a tool. All right, so I'm guessing that on this particular expedition in 1897, Osborn didn't get his hands dirty. I think that's pretty clear. Now, a little bit more about Osborn's ambitions. So I mentioned that Osborn was the founder and first curator of the DVP. He was a young man at this point. He was a trained paleomammologist. So that's a guy who specializes in fossil mammals. So this is somebody who went to school, studied fossil mammals, was a well-published scholar, but only on fossil mammals, had never published anything on any other group, certainly not on dinosaurs. But yet, this is the point where his department, the department he founded, is just making its start in dinosaur paleontology. Osborn, you should know, has ambitions to build the premier American vertebrate paleontology program, right? At this point, they aren't. And I'm going to say a little bit more about who was. The Yale Peabody Museum under O.C. Marsh was arguably the best, certainly the most prominent, certainly the largest, certainly the most well-known paleontology program in America. Osborn wanted to supersede them. All right, that was Osborn's ambition. All right, now I already mentioned that Osborn didn't do a lot of digging at Como Bluff. So the quarry was actually opened not by people like Osborn, but by seasonal field workers, hard-scrabble guys like these two guys. I've already told you about this one. That's Barnum Brown, right, the discoverer of T-Rex. The guy next to him, does anybody recognize that guy? Has anybody heard of Harold Menke? All right, I knew at least one of you had heard of Harold Menke. No one else has ever heard of Harry Menke. Oh, there's somebody back there. I want to talk to you. Harry Menke is probably the least, I don't know how to put this exactly. He is the most accomplished person from this era in vertebrate paleontology that nobody, other than that guy, has ever heard of. All right? And he's important for a lot of reasons, but I just want to focus on one small thing today. So the rest of the talk is largely going to be about Harry Menke. All right? The uncelebrated hardscrabble seasonal collector for the DVP. So again, these two guys are doing all the work, right? They're doing all the muscle. Osborn's supervising, and Osborn obviously has a permanent position. These guys are seasonal collectors. But they're young men. They've just finished college. Actually, Menke just finished college. Barnum Brown never finished, or hadn't finished at this point. They both want permanent jobs at the DVP. Now, Brown already has a leg up on Menke. He's already pretty sure at this point that he's going to get a permanent job. Menke, on the other hand, probably feels at this point like his chances are slim. And so he needs something, he needs to do something to impress the powers that be at the DVP. And this is what he does. So Menke decides he volunteers to overwinter at the field site in Wyoming. Now, for those of you who've never been to Wyoming, you probably won't appreciate what a sacrifice this is. But I'm here to tell you, so remember my first picture, Brown and Osborn at Como Bluff, right? They're both wearing coats. Osborn's wearing that heavy coat. That's June. It snowed that morning, right? Their work was interrupted that very morning because it had snowed, like 4 inches of snow. Now it all melted, of course, very quickly. The point is, it's cold all the time at this part of Wyoming, right? So if it snows sometimes in June, and you have to wear a coat to do field work in June, imagine what it's like in January. And Menke has volunteered to stay over the entire winter, to overwinter. He lives in a very primitive cabin. He probably has to chop his own firewood, or he probably has to haul coal from somewhere. There's not even a hint of civilization at this particular part of Wyoming. So this is near the southwest corner of Wyoming. In my first slide, there was a beautiful watercolor painting of Como Bluff, and if you looked really closely, you could see a train in the distance. Even that train was gone by 1897. It was so remote, they moved the train to another part of Wyoming and cut Como Bluff off. So it was even less civilized in 1897 than it was in that watercolor painting I showed you earlier. Literally nothing was at Como Bluff. He lived in an abandoned cabin. Probably the glass was broken. He stayed there all winter. It was brutally cold. He probably hardly ever talked to a soul. He was bored and lonely. And he spent the entire season there. All right, now he had a couple missions. So first of all, he overwintered because Osborn wanted somebody to babysit the quarry during the winter for fear that someone else who'd heard about the DVP's success at Como Bluff might come and claim jump. Does everybody know what I mean by that? So hearing that AM&H had found that the DVP had found dinosaurs at this quarry, Osborn was worried that someone else would come along as soon as they cleared out and start digging up their specimens. So first of all, he was there simply to babysit the quarry. But meanwhile, Osborn's paying him probably a very small amount of money. I don't know what his salary was, but I'm guessing it was next to nothing. I'm guessing it was only slightly more than I make here. So he was getting next to nothing. But Osborn, in the meantime, wanted him not just to sit around, not just babysit the quarry, but to spend, if the weather was good, he wanted Menke to go out and look for more dinosaur prospects at Como Bluff. When the weather was bad, he wanted him to sift through what they were calling pay dirt. It was just a large accumulation of what paleontologists call matrix, rock. And he wanted to sort through, Osborn wanted Menke to sort through that rock looking for tiny specimens of fossil mammals. Now, the pictures I've put on this slide, right, these are much, much larger than they were in life. So a jaw like this from a Jurassic mammal is probably about that big. And the individual teeth, jaws are rare, right? Individual teeth, probably about that big. They're tiny. The best place to find them, ant hills. So ants collect these. So that's how meticulous the work is, right? That's the level of detail that Menke has to work at. Meanwhile, he's freezing, right? It's dark, it's cold, and he's sorting through, he's sitting there probably at a table, right, picking through matrix, shivering, looking for teeth. Well, needless to say, he didn't find a lot of specimens that winter, all right? But he did find something very interesting, and that's what I want to talk about today. So rather than fossils, and he did find some fossils. It's not that he found none, but he found very few. But arguably his most significant discovery of that winter was actually a bundle of discarded correspondence from a guy named O.C. Marsh to another guy named Fred Brown. All right. Now, by the way, this picture, this is not the actual correspondence that Menke found. I can't find a picture of that. This is just somebody's correspondence from the 19th century. So just to give you an idea what it might have looked like. So this is where my title comes from. So Menke knows that there are former quarry sites at Como Bluff where a gentleman named O.C. Marsh, the guy who was in charge of the Yale Peabody Museum, I already mentioned that's the premier vertebrate paleontology program in America. O.C. Marsh runs that program. So he's Osborn's arch rival. So Menke, who's overwintering at Como Bluff, knows that there's all these sites that O.C. Marsh's collectors had once worked in the 1870s and 1880s, and where they discovered fossil mammals, fossil dinosaurs, many, many, many very important specimens. Now, some of these quarries have been reburied, right? So after Marsh's collectors abandoned these holes, they filled them back in, right? So that what we call overburden, the stuff they took out of the hole in order to remove the dinosaurs, then they just put it back in the hole. Well, Menke, must have realized, well, this is a potentially important spot to maybe find additional fossils, right? If the hole was fossiliferous in the first place, maybe there's still fossils there. So he digs up some of these old piles of dirt in these old holes. He doesn't find many fossils, but he does find this bunch of letters. Now, so this is the 19th century. The way that a guy like Marsh, who almost never went in the field, communicated with his field workers was by they sent letters back and forth. And these letters tended to accumulate because, of course, Marsh was a bit of a micromanager. How many of you have heard of O.C. Marsh? The same three people? I knew it. The guy who's heard of Menke, where is he? You've heard of Menke but not Marsh? You're not paying attention anymore? So, did I wake you? Okay, so I apologize. So Marsh is pretty famous. He's a lot more famous than Menke. Again, he's the head paleontologist at the Yale Peabody Museum. So Marsh, a micromanager, is sending lots of letters out to his collector. In this case, it's Fred Brown. It doesn't really matter. I'm not going to talk about Fred Brown. The important thing is that Marsh, just like Osborn, hired flunkies, younger, ambitious young people to go out and do the manual labor. And then he would send them directions, like, please do this, please pay attention to that, make sure you do this next time you ship me fossils, things like this. And so that's what these letters consist of. Now, Menke discovers this abandoned correspondence in one of the holes. All right? Now, think about this. The U.S. mail is sacred. You find a bunch of abandoned letters, what do? Well, he did what disreputable historians like myself do all the time. He read the letters. Of course he read the letters, right? And he realized immediately that the letters contained a lot of and I'm totally lost where I am in my talk, by the way. I'm going to have to find these because I can't read that far. So he realizes immediately, Menke, reading the letters, he realizes that they contain a lot of useful, potentially useful intelligence that Osborn might want to have. This includes information about what was found in what hole, what was really productive, what was less productive. So potentially there's a lot of really useful information in these letters. Menke realizes this right away. And again, remember, he's looking to curry favor with Osborn. He wants a job working for Osborn. So he thinks to himself, okay, here's a leg up for me. He sends Osborn the letters. And here's the very first letter that mentions it. He says, "Dear sir, I enclose you part of a fossil correspondence." It's a funny term. "A fossil correspondence which I uncovered from a pile of rubbish." Thus my title, Research from Rubbish. "The mammal quarry 9 is mentioned, hence I thought you might like to see the letters." Well, yeah, I certainly would. I can imagine Osborn reading this letter and thinking, oh man, what a gold mine, right? Maybe Menke's not finding any fossils out there, but this is potentially even more valuable. So Osborn writes him back, not right away, but relatively soon, and this is his reply. He writes, "Dear Mr. Menke, it will be a good plan for you to forward Professor Marsh's letters. They may be of service to us in indicating the various quarries, and I shall not make any unfair use of them. Now this tells you something right away, doesn't it? He definitely plans to make unfair use of these letters, right? No question about it, right? All right, so this is pretty interesting. So, and I'm skipping a few things here in the interest of time. The next letter from Osborn to Menke brings this point up again. So he says, "Dear Mr. Menke, I prefer you will not mention the letters which you have sent me, as we shall of course use them merely for the information they contain regarding the quarries." Blah, blah, blah. The rest of it isn't that important. Thou doth protest too much. Am I right? Right. Obviously, Osborn wants to use these for some nefarious purposes. Now, what possible reason could Osborn have for wanting these letters? Well, there's a really long version of this story. I'm going to give you the really short one. The short version is that Osborn hated Marsh's guts. It wasn't just professional, it was personal. He had a very personal rivalry with Marsh. Now, one of the reasons for this is that Marsh had had a feud with Henry Fairfield Osborn's mentor, Edward Drinker Cope. Has anybody heard of Edward Drinker Cope? All right. A few more people. That's good. So Cope was Osborn's mentor. Cope and Marsh feuded infamously. You've probably heard of the Bone Wars or the Fossil Wars or the dinosaurs. There's dozens of books about this. How many people have seen like the PBS special on the Bone Wars? Have you seen that? That's Cope versus Marsh, right? That's probably the most famous story in American paleontological history, right? If there's one story that a lot of people know, it's Cope versus Marsh. Well, the story continued. So Cope had died. Cope died in April 1897. Cope literally died while these letters were being written, right? One of the reasons, Osborn blames Marsh for having ruined Cope's career. That's not true at all. There's no truth to that. They didn't like each other and they feuded, but Cope brought some of that on himself. But Osborn blames Marsh for having ruined Cope's career, and he wants to continue this feud with Marsh. So Cope is dead, but Osborn wants to continue the feud. And so he sees these letters not only as a potential source of valuable intelligence about the quarries, but more importantly, he sees it as an opportunity to collect dirt on Marsh. Because among other things, the letters detail things like Marsh missing payments to his field workers, like Marsh giving bad advice to his field workers, habits of Marsh's that his field collectors hated were detailed in some of these letters. And Osborn recognizes this as a potential chance to collect what he called Marshiana. If anyone who's heard that term before has read books about Cope versus Marsh, because the most famous collection of Marshiana ever made was Cope's personal collection, which Osborn inherited. And now he's going to add to this collection by literally taking Marsh's own words, his own letters to his field collectors, and using them against him. All right, so that's one of Osborn's motives for being excited about these letters. But of course, he doesn't want this to get out to other people. He doesn't want anyone else to know, right, that he's doing this. He certainly doesn't want Marsh to know what his sources for this information, what they are. And so he tells Menke, let's keep that between us, right? I won't use them for any nefarious purposes. But of course we know that's not true. But Menke, he's a smart guy. Menke replies right away, and he says, "You may be assured I will mention the letters to no one." And as far as I know, he never did. So there's no letters from Menke to anyone else saying, hey, you're not going to believe this, but when I was at Como in '97, I found these letters. They were fantastic. He never says this. So as far as I know, he never shares this information with anybody. All right. Now, the reason this is interesting from a scientific point of view, from a history of science point of view, is that very shortly after this correspondence between Osborn and Menke regarding these letters, very soon after this, Osborn suddenly has a change of heart about his dinosaur paleontology program at the DVP. And this is pretty interesting. It's kind of long, but I'm going to read you the whole thing. So this is a letter that Osborn sends to Menke, writes to Menke. This is what he says. Dear Mr. Menke, so this is April 30th. Dear Mr. Menke, I started out in these beds with the idea of simply making a collection, not expecting to find much that is new. So in other words, he just wanted to collect dinosaurs to put on display, things to put in the collection. That's what he's admitting. Now I have the idea that we shall make grand additions to our knowledge of these animals, and that Professor Marsh's work is as faulty among the reptiles as it is proved to be among the mammals, and must be reformed and rewritten from top to bottom. Now this is a really fascinating letter. Remember, Osborn's training is in fossil mammals. His entire experience up to this point is in fossil mammals only. He's never worked, to the best of my knowledge, never worked on a single dinosaur in his entire life. What else is interesting is the date of this letter. So this is April 1898. So at this point, Osborn has probably not seen a single Jurassic dinosaur specimen yet. All he knows is Marsh's body of work and these letters that Marsh wrote to his collectors. All right, so this raises the interesting question, how is he so sure that he's now going to rewrite and reform Marsh's work on the dinosaurs from top to bottom? He hasn't even seen a dinosaur specimen. And what I'm going to argue here, and I'm going to give you a very flimsy evidence for this, by the way, in support of my argument, but what I'm going to argue is that Osborn's confidence that he can reform and rewrite Marsh comes directly from this fossil correspondence. All right? Okay, how does that work? That's what I'm going to explain next. Okay, so in order to do this, I'm going to have to tell you, I'm going to have to give you at least one example. So I could have given you 20 examples, but in the interest of time, I'm only going to give you one. All right? So this is a generalization based on one instance. All right? So what did Marsh's discarded letters say? Right? Is there anything interesting in them at all? Well, I picked this letter, and I want to read this letter to you and talk a little bit about what it means. So this is, again, one of the letters that Menke found at Como Bluff and sent to Osborn says this. So this is a letter from Marsh at Yale to his field collector, Fred Brown, who's working at Como Bluff in the 1880s. And this is what he says in 1886. Dear Mr. Brown, and that's not Barnum Brown, that's Fred Brown, Marsh's collector. Dear Mr. Brown, the diagrams came today and are very interesting. The one with the 4 spines over the tail is most important, especially if you can tell me what the rest of the skeleton is like. There's so many letters from people like Osborn and Marsh to their collectors saying, if only you could tell me what the rest of the skeleton looks like. It's hilarious, as though they have something to say or to do about what they find in the field, right? So Marsh is saying, hey, find me a Stegosaurus, is what he's saying there. But this is where it gets really interesting. So Marsh asks his collectors some direct questions about the fossil evidence. He says, did the 2 pairs of spines found together last year belong with the tail? Look out sharp for the position of all plates and spines. Okay, what's he talking about here? And why does this matter? All right, this is interesting because it tells us that in 1886, the year that this letter was written, Marsh still doesn't know what Stegosaurus looks like. Specifically, he doesn't know how these dorsal plates are arranged. See these big plates that run along the spine here? He doesn't know how these are arranged, their number, their order. Are they paired? Do they go down the middle of the backbone? Are they lateral? How are they arranged? Also, these tail spikes. How many are there? Are they paired? Do they stick up? Do they stick out? How are they arranged? Marsh doesn't know this yet. And we know he doesn't know this yet because this is what he's asking Fred Brown, his collector, to keep an eye on in the field. If you find any stegosaurs, he's telling him, make sure you take careful note of where the dorsal plates are found and where the tail spikes are found. That's what I need to know. That's what he's telling his collector. Does everybody understand that? Okay. But yet, Marsh, then in 1891, so what is that? I'm not good at math. That's why I got into history. 5 years later, Marsh publishes this reconstruction of Stegosaurus. So this tells us that in 1886 he didn't know how the plates were arranged, he didn't know how the tail spikes were arranged, but by 1891, 5 years later, he decided that it looks like this. And this is a classic image of Stegosaurus. We've all seen this one before, right? Yes? Yes. Okay, good. It's flawed. So for one thing, it looks like it's just one row of dorsal plates running along the spine. We now believe that that's incorrect. We now believe they were paired and also staggered. That doesn't really matter, though. Same thing with the tail spikes. We now think, and correct me if I'm wrong, dinosaur people, we now think it was 2 pairs of 2 spines, so 4 total spines, not 8. And it looks like this diagram shows 8 tail spikes. Is that correct? Am I correct in that? Okay. So the diagram is wrong, but that's not really what I'm getting at here. What's really interesting here is that I think that the letter that Marsh wrote to Menke, and this is just one example, and there are other examples I could have talked about, but I'm only going to talk about this one again in the interest of time. I believe that Osborn reads this letter and immediately concludes that the letter suggests that this is an avenue of weakness, right, in Marsh's body of work. Does everybody understand what I mean by that? So Osborn reads this letter and he thinks, okay, Marsh doesn't know how the dorsal plates are arranged or how the tail spikes are arranged. This is something I can attack him for, okay? How do I know this? Am I just leaping to conclusions here? Of course I am. But there is at least a tiny bit of evidence in support of this idea. I want to read you one more letter. This one's from Osborn to Menke about the fossil correspondence. This is what he writes, and this one's a little long, so bear with me. He writes in May 1898, "Dear Mr. Menke, I should be quite interested to hear whether you find that the animal is a stegosaur." So this tells us something. This tells us that his field collectors who are already working to collect new specimens have found something that they think might be a stegosaur. Turns out that it wasn't. But Osborn's excited to hear that it could be a stegosaur because it could tell us something about the true arrangement of the plates and the spikes. So that's what that sentence is about. But then he goes on to say, and this is really interesting, he goes on to say, "If so, the matter of greatest importance is the exact determination of the position of the plates upon the dorsal vertebrae. If you study Marsh's figures of the dorsals and view, you will see that the lateral processes of the vertebrae are much larger than the median spines, rendering it probable that they were for support of the plates. The plates are symmetrical below, showing that they were lateral and not median in position. The confirmation of this view of the case will be of great importance." So he's saying more or less exactly what Marsh had said in his letter to Fred Brown in 1886. Is there any way for us to determine from specimens in the field how the dorsal plates are arranged and how the tail spikes are arranged? And if so, this is exactly what he's going to criticize Marsh's work for. So what I'm arguing then is that Osborn's research program in American Jurassic dinosaurs comes directly, not from fossils, which is where we usually think that vertebrate paleontology research comes from, and where 7 times out of 10 it does come from? Am I right? This is a case where it comes not from fossils, but from a discarded pile of letters that Harry Menke found in an abandoned quarry. Questions?
Yeah, probably. Thanks, Paul. Hey, all right.
Thank you.
Y'all got all that? Paul's going to quiz you on it at the end of the Q&A.
So the next science trivia is going to be 30 questions from my talk.
So if you do have questions, wave at me. I've got a microphone. Katie has a microphone. We'll bring one to you. And we've got lots of time for Q&A, so let's get started. And if I haven't gotten to you yet, eyeball one of us and just, let us know you've got questions. We're going to try to get to as many as we can.
I got a question for you.
Who am I? Oh,
Over here. So I
gentleman in
understand
the
why.
middle.
I understand why they would fill in the holes today, but why back then when they were digging out that stuff and they would go to that much trouble to refill the holes?
That's a good question because that's a lot of work. So one of the reasons I don't know. So this has never been addressed, as far as I know, in any letters. But if I had to guess, and your question calls for a guess because I don't know. If I had to guess, I'd say it was to keep people like Cope, Osborn, and their collectors from finding anything in those quarries. That would be my best guess. So this was a fairly common thing to do, to refill in quarries if you didn't want someone else to get to them. It does still happen today for different reasons, right? Now collectors are required to fill in the holes. It's called, what's the word we use for this?
Reclamation.
Reclamation, thank you. I knew it started with an R. Reclamation. So the idea being, hey, look, you're collecting these fossils on federal land. We want it to look like it looked when you got here. And so we fill the holes back in. Back then, of course, that was not the standard, but the reason that they did this reburial, I think, one, they were probably burying their garbage. So they probably made garbage, food garbage, old tin cans, so they might have buried it at the site in their original quarries. So in fact, some archaeology is sometimes done on these old quarries, and stuff gets found, broken tools, matches, newspapers. So there's a gentleman in Canada who actually does a lot of history of science, history of paleontology, based on the archaeological excavations, of old quarry holes, and he finds things like newspapers, and now he can date the work to the day where before he might not have known, and might not have had any idea when somebody dug up that hole. So that's another reason why they might have reburied these holes, to bury their own garbage.
I have a question.
Yes.
I know that you've done a fair amount of research, field work in your time.
With you,
yeah,
as a matter of fact.
Have you ever buried any documents for future paleontologists to find?
So that's a great question. The short answer is no. The long answer, I'm going to think about that for a second. So I don't remember having ever done that. However, as I think you well know, I do keep very meticulous records of field work, but I don't bury them at the field sites. I take them back with me. So I've got all kinds of dirt up in my office right now about paleontologists at this institution and at other institutions as well. And that is what my retirement is going to be based on that. So there are many, many written records that I've kept from expeditions like these, but I don't bury them. I keep them with me. So I have a small archive in my office of these things.
So I have a question. Did they ever find enough specimens at this site to get the spines and the thagomizer?
Oh, I should have used that term, thagomizer. Thank you for bringing that up. The short answer of that one is no. So the possible stegosaur prospect that Osborn mentioned in his letter to Menke, it turned out not to be a stegosaurus. So it was another sauropod. Stegosaurs are actually kind of uncommon, relatively uncommon in the American Jurassic. When you collect in the Morrison Formation, which is where this is, overwhelmingly you find sauropod dinosaurs. Does everybody know what a sauropod is? Brontosaurus. If you recognize that as a legitimate taxon, which I don't. Apatosaurus, Brachiosaurus, Camarasaurus, Diplodocus, Pleurocoelus, right over here in the acrodome. These are the really large, the enormously large, four-legged, long-tailed, long-necked, tiny-head dinosaurs.
Herbivores.
Herbivores, thank you. Was that Katie? Was that you? Nice.
Woo.
Herbivores. These are when you think of dinosaurs, you probably think of Tyrannosaurus rex first, but then you think of sauropods, is what I'm guessing. And this is what you usually find in the American Jurassic. Stegosaurus is relatively rare, and that specimen that they found was not, in fact, a Stegosaurus. I don't know if AM&H, I'm sure they have Stegosaurus specimens in the DVP, but I don't know if they have a good one. There's a great one at Yale. There's some great ones at the Smithsonian. Denver has some excellent ones. But do you guys know if AM&H has any good stegosaur material? They do?
I thought that they did have one on display. Don't they have one on display there? I think pretty sure.
But it's a composite.
Oh.
Right? I mean, it's still undoubtedly several good specimens, but it's a composite. It's not a single specimen. Ooh, sorry. Does Carnegie have one? Do they have a good one? They might. They collected even more than the DVP did in the American Jurassic, so I wouldn't be surprised if they have a good one too. But the point is they didn't get one in the 1890s. If they got one, it came later. They worked this same quarry, by the way, for the next 10 years. So they opened it in 1897, and they didn't abandon this quarry until 1907, exactly 10 years later. So this is their first 2 field seasons, 97 and 98. Yes?
Hey, one question. Why do herbivore dinosaurs tend to have longer necks than, you know, the meat eaters?
I have no idea.
Okay.
I don't know. Sorry, that's a question for a paleontologist. I don't know. To reach, I mean, I'm going to give you the, you know, the Encyclopedia Britannica answer, which is to reach the leaves on trees.
We've got one here.
Like a giraffe.
How did all these letters come to be published?
None of them have been published, as a matter of fact.
Well, made available. You were reading from them.
Yes. So that's an interesting question. So there's actually a fantastic website run by the Yale Peabody Museum of Marsh's correspondence. So Marsh was one of those people who had a sense that he was doing something really important even while he was doing it. So he kept very meticulous records. He kept his own correspondence. He kept copies of the letters he sent to other people. He kept all kinds of documents. Those all survived after he died, and they stayed at the Yale Peabody Museum. And in the 2000s, probably less than 10 years ago, although I'm guessing, I don't know when this happened, but someone at Yale, at the Yale Peabody Museum, applied for money to have all these letters scanned and put online. And so the Marsh papers are now available online at the Yale Peabody Museum. But you won't find any of the letters I quoted today in that collection. Why? Because they're still at the AM&H. So Menke sent these letters to Osborn. Osborn kept it real hush-hush, right? They're still there. And as far as I know, the people at Yale don't know that these letters are at the AM&H. But they're going to know soon, because I'm writing a story about this. And one of these days I'm going to publish. Not that it's a big deal. It's not like they're going to demand those letters back, right? I mean, this is a very old problem, but they'll probably ask for copies. And if the DVP won't give them to them, I'll give them to them myself, because I've transcribed all these letters already. So, yeah. So the question was, how long did Menke get to work for Osborn after he found the letters? And the answer is 0. So Menke, as I mentioned, really wants to get a full-time job, a permanent job at the DVP. He doesn't get it. So he overwinters in 98. He does work for the summer of 98 for the DVP, right? So because he's still there. I mean, he's literally there when the DVP field party arrives. So he continues to work for the DVP that summer. And then they fired him. And then he went to work for the DVP's chief new rival, the Field Columbian Museum in Chicago, taking a lot of valuable intelligence about Jurassic quarries with him. So, kind of interesting. Yes?
Hey, so I kind of have 2 questions.
2 questions?
Yeah.
All right.
So back then, this was obviously a time before we had GPS systems. So now we identify our quarries with very precise location information. So I'm interested, how did back then, if they had to leave or come back or tell other people where the quarry was, how did they, what kind of information did they use to allow people to get back to some of these really remote places? And are all of these quarries from back then, are they still, are we still able to find them now, or have any of them been lost to time?
So I'm going to start with the end of your question. Lots of these quarries have been lost. And I mentioned that this gentleman at the Drumheller Museum, Darren Tankey, has been working to relocate a lot of these quarries because, of course, again, potentially very valuable information can be found by recovering the quarries, right? By doing the geology that some of the paleontologists back then skipped, by doing taphonomy, by getting sediment samples, and doing the kind of analyses that paleontologists didn't do in the 1890s. So there are people who are trying to relocate the quarries of really important, really famous specimens, but the bad news is a lot of them are probably irretrievable. I mean, who knows? Darren's had a lot of success finding some of these quarries, but a lot of them are lost. Now, some people were better than others at mapping these locations or describing the locations of their quarries. So some of them are easier to find, hypothetically, than others. I think some are simply gone. We'll never be able to find, for instance, the DVP's quarries in the Black Hills. We'll never know where those are, because those the locality data we still have for that is like, it's 8 miles east of the post office, and of course that post office no longer exists. So even if you knew where it was, you'd still have like a giant area to search, right? So a lot of that information is now gone. And the way they tracked these things was, well, to use an un-PC word, primitive, right? Verbal descriptions like east of the railroad and then slightly north, things like that. Or a map. Sometimes they made maps. And some of the maps are pretty good, but most of them are garbage, as you might guess, right? Imagine the kind of maps that you put in your field notebooks. They look like that. Okay. Yeah.
His map specifically?
Yeah.
Oh, gosh.
There were 2 questions, though. Oh, no, go ahead.
You mentioned a few books about the Bone Wars. Was there one that you'd recommend in particular?
A book?
Yeah, a book.
Yeah. So if you're interested in Cope versus Marsh, I think the best book is David Rains Wallace. The Bone Hunter's Revenge. I think that they all have terrible titles. This one I think is called The Bone Hunter's Revenge. I think that one's the best one, and it's still in print. I think you can get that. Actually, I used that one in my class. You can get that one for like probably $5 in paper. That's the best one. But there's probably a dozen more. Earl Lanham's book's really good. Mark Jaffe's book is pretty good. Elizabeth Noble Shore's book is excellent, but that's no longer in print. That's probably my favorite, but that one's really hard to find. And there's lots of garbage books too. Tons of them. But I'd start with Wallace. That one's really good.
Thank you.
If you've got questions, wave at us. We'll bring a microphone to you. But Paul, how did you track down this story? It's not published anywhere. These things aren't readily available. So how did you trace and track down, not just finding the letters, but tracing the story over the years?
Sometimes when people ask me about this kind of work, like the kind of work I do, I often compare it to paleontology, because in some ways it's very similar. So like in paleontology, sometimes you have, and again, feel free to interrupt me if I'm way out, if I'm in left field here, please, don't hesitate. But in paleontology, maybe you have an idea that, I'm really interested in this particular animal. And I really want to answer this particular question about this particular animal. And so you go to a place where you're likely to find that particular animal, and you look around, and you try and find fossils, and then you dig them up. And 99 times out of 100, you don't find that animal. You find a different animal. But now you think to yourself, well, I can either keep going back in the field and look for that particular animal, or I could do something on this one. And that's why we have grad students. So graduate students inherit a lot of these projects, these sort of spin-off projects from big digs, right? Well, so-and-so's interested in theropod dinosaurs, but we found all these turtles. Somebody's got to work on them, am I right? So somebody works on the turtles. Well, history of paleontology is very similar. So sometimes I sit in my office, I take some naps, and then I wake up with an idea, and I think to myself, what would be really interesting is to write a story about X. And so I think to myself, well, the best place to find information about X would be to go to X's archive. And so I go to X's archive, and I don't find anything about that story, but I find something completely different that sometimes is 10 times more interesting than the original story I went to research. And this story, the Making Research from Rubbish story, is exactly that. So it's a byproduct of a different project that I was working on, and I just found this fossil correspondence while looking for something else. And I thought, well, this is interesting. And so I decided to work on it. And so what you do is when you find something like this, think of this as like the toe bone of a dinosaur. Well, then you want to find the ankle, or the foot, then the ankle. Am I right? I'm not a very good anatomist. So foot bone, then ankle, then lower limb, right? Then maybe the knee. And this is what you do in history of science also. So you find some really interesting set of letters. The obvious thing to do is to find the other half of the correspondence. And so that's what I did. That's what I looked for. And then, of course, because I knew that this correspondence was referred to by Menke and Osborn, I looked at their correspondence. Is there any more information in there that I can find? And one thing leads to another, just like if you're digging up a dinosaur, right? And that's essentially how I put the story together. Of course, there's lots of things still missing. Sometimes I guess, just like paleontologists do. Right?
So,
yes,
I have a question.
Okay.
So, what would you say is the biggest difference between, or are there any differences between that time of paleontology and this day and age of paleontology?
Who are you feuding with?
Are these same kind of stories going on?
Kind of, but not really. I mean, if you're asking me, do we still have these sort of vicious feuds? Not really. There's still plenty of rivalry, of course, and there are people who can't stand other people. But that's true of any field of inquiry, right? And one of the reasons for this, of course, is because of the scarcity of resources. So people sometimes ask me, why were they so mean? Well, the answer is because there were so few fossils. If it was easy to go out and find a complete T-Rex, if all you had to do was like drive out to Montana, walk around for a while and find one, and anyone who wanted one could have access to one, they wouldn't have to fight over access to these things. What's maybe one field that's even more acrimonious than vertebrate paleontology? Hominid paleontology. Why? Because there are even fewer of those, right? Because lots of people are interested in these big questions about the evolution of human beings, right, but there are only a handful of specimens to work on. And if you have control over those specimens, then you get to tell other people whether or not they can look at your fossils. And this is one of the reasons that paleontologists bicker, right? And of course they disagree about the interpretation of the evidence, but that's true of all fields, right? So it does still go on, but it's not as, it's toned down. It's more polite, it's more professional, it's not nearly as underhanded as it used to be. There aren't any more gunfights that I know of over fossils. Maybe a fist fight now and then, but even that's kind of uncommon. So it's toned down a little bit, but there's still a lot of rivalry, and you still hear about, lots of disputes in paleontology, and they're still funny. And someday, someone's going to write stories about people in the, early 21st century and how funny it was when they fought over fossils, right? And they're going to use my journals to do it. So I can't wait.
Is it just that you can delete the tweets these days?
So one person asked me once, isn't this a disaster for your field of work, right? And I thought about that, and I was like, oh man, now that I think about it, maybe it is. Because my main sources, I mostly work in the 19th century. It's not an accident that one, it's the most interesting century, but two, there's very rich archival resources about the 19th century, because what did they do in the 19th century? I mean, we've all read Jane Austen novels. They sat around in their parlors and they wrote really long and descriptive letters to each other. So this is a really rich resource for historians, for people who do the work like I do. So what does it mean that people don't write letters anymore? Well, for a long time it meant there's a big black hole in historical research in the early 20th century, because what were they doing then? They were calling each other, right? And talking about their work over the phone. There's no record for that. Email hasn't replaced the letter. It's replaced the phone call. And a lot of people save their emails. So a lot of people like O.C. Marsh, right, have this feeling that they're doing something really important. And so I know people who print out and file their emails. Do you guys do that? All right, good. So I'm not making fun of anybody here. I just want that to be clear. But there are people in paleontology who do this. And one day, I mean, it's funny to make, because we all know what we email to each other, right? This stuff is not worth saving, right? 99% of it is garbage. But I know people who save this stuff. And one day, historians are going to be really grateful for it because it's going to be a gold mine of data, right? About the history of 21st century paleontology.
Okay. So when did they finally come up with the Stegosaurus, and when did they decide how the plates really were positioned, and who did that?
So that's a good question. So the real truth in paleontology is there really is never any final word about anything, right? So, I mean, I'm not one of these people who's going to deny that we make progress, because we certainly do. With every new good specimen, we learn new things about a taxon, right? A given taxon. And these things accumulate, right? Because we don't unlearn the things that we learn. Now, we do reinterpret the evidence sometimes. So sometimes you find a fossil and you think, oh, it must go together like this. And that's the paradigm for a long time until what happens? You find a better specimen that suggests, no, it was actually probably like this. And so the jury's still out on, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, so the best interpretation of Stegosaurus today is that those plates are paired, but also staggered. So they're not paired like this, they're paired like this. Right, all the way down the backbone, but not right down the median line. They're slightly lateral. And then as far as the tail spikes, that there's 2 pairs of 2, not 8, and that they aren't like this. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, but they're more like this. But that's just the current final word. Someday, someone may find a better specimen that actually tells us something different. So there's really no such thing as knowing in paleontology, right? There's the best available explanation only. Do you understand what I mean by that? And one day, hypothetically, there could be a better one. But right now, we believe that's true because it's the best available explanation.
Let's give him one more round of applause.
Well, we're finished?
Get out.
We're out of time, ladies and gentlemen.
No more. No, thank you, Paul.
Thank you. Thanks.
And hey, thanks to all of you for coming out. Hope you enjoyed this talk. That was interesting.
Was it?
I work at a science museum. I think science is great. And then here's a history talk.
Did anybody
but
the note of surprise?
That was a lot.
That was interesting.
That was interesting. No, I knew it was going to be great. I think you knew it was going to be great too. So thanks to you all for coming out tonight. Don't forget, next Thursday night, we'll be over in the WRAL 3D Theater with Dr. Rob Dunn from NC State with his book, Never Home Alone. You'll be able to purchase copies of the book and get them signed by Dr. Dunn next Thursday too. So I hope you'll all come out for that event. And stay tuned to naturalsciences.org for more events. There's always cool stuff happening here at the museum. Good night, everybody. Oh, and hey, if you like this, fill out the survey. At the bottom of the survey, there's a place where you can put your email address. We'll add you to the science.